Hi there, it's Ron Gula with another episode of the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. Today we're joined by Bob Zukis. Bob, how are you?
Hi, Ron. Great to be here.
So Bob was introduced to Cindy and I by Tony Cole. Tony highly recommended you, Bob, as an expert in a number of different areas. But one of the things that we're going to talk about is board governance, not only for public companies, but for any board specific to cybersecurity. So, Bob, how did we get here? What's your background? How did you end up being in a position to recommend cybersecurity and data governance controls for public and private boards?
Yeah, Ron, it's been a long journey, 30 plus years, mostly as a partner at PwC, so management consulting partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Lived and worked all over the world. Ran our IT strategy and ops and several of our data management business units. And so I was winding down my career at PwC. I started to talk to our clients' boards, and I had expected these issues to be table stakes in the boardroom, to see people across the boardroom table that I was familiar with, CIOs, CISOs, my client base, and didn't see them, and felt like there was a problem here. And so what happened is the markets really validated that problem. And we saw breach after breach, from Target to Equifax, SolarWinds, now what we're seeing more broadly from a systemic perspective, really validate that this was a big problem. And we need to get the skills, the capabilities, the right structure, the right approach into the boardroom to really govern these issues at an effective level. And I had also kind of connected the dots back to what I'd lived through with Sarbanes-Oxley at PwC. It was only 20 years ago when it was a novel concept to have somebody in the boardroom that understood a financial statement. So we've been through these kind of threshold competency gaps before on corporate boards. So took it up as kind of a mantle to fix that problem.
And for people who are listening or watching and they're not really familiar with like the structure of a board, you're also a member of like NACD, right? So that's with the A's for account. What's NACD stand for?
The National Association of Corporate Directors.
Right. And what do they do? Like, what's the structures that they have from a finance and oversight point of view? And then what's missing on the board side for cybersecurity and data?
NACD was really the first, call it boardroom association, professional association. It's a not-for-profit, really focused on advancing leading corporate governance practices in North America, but they also work with some of the other national corporate governance groups around the world. And, when you look at board structures, you're usually looking at a body of 10 or 15 people who have the responsibility and the fiduciary duty to govern and to work with the management teams that are running organizations, whether it's a for-profit company or a not-for-profit company. The responsibilities can be the same as they are for private companies as well, although the regulatory landscape and the legal landscape is different for all three of those type of private company bodies. But, the obligations are really the same: to monitor and to advise, to be that body, the senior most body of the organization, helping it succeed over the long term.
And would you say, from a finance point of view, from an accounting or just governance point of view, practicing with those standards, you could almost get pulled out of one public company and dropped into another public company? It's the same language, the same business problems, the same sort of thought process, isn't it? Isn't that the case?
Yeah, from an accounting and finance standpoint, it's well developed. Let's put it that way. And obviously, the issues across sectors are very different. And capital structures can be unique across different organizations. But the legal framework, the law is very mature, and it really has matured over the last 20 years on the back of Sarbanes-Oxley and what that forced to do from a financial reporting standpoint with Enron and WorldCom and the other financial reporting disasters that we were facing back then. The regulators, the SEC, came at this with a very big stick because the capital markets were at risk.
And because this is so well done on the finance and transparency, corporate governance side, but not for IT, not for data, not for cybersecurity, you've started the Digital Directors Network. And I would dare say that you're trying to create an NACD for cyber, for IT. Is that how you look at it?
Yeah, that's pretty much how we look at it. Yeah, we're trying to go a mile deep on the whole digital and cyber and systemic risk issue. I would also say, the accounting profession and the audit committee function has done a fantastic job, almost too good of a job, because what we see kind of a lot of skills and capabilities and responsibilities kind of get thrown into the audit committee. Whether they belong there or not is another issue, given how busy that committee is from an accounting and finance standpoint frequently. And cyber is most frequently thrown into the audit committee, which is what we like to say, a leading bad practice, because you don't have the skills, you don't have the capability, you have a very busy committee focused on accounting issues, and there are better ways to do it.
And it's really something, because when we think about accounting and the great, I mean, when I left Tenable, it was doing hundreds of $1 million in revenue. We're getting ready to go public. It's public now. The amount of confidence that you have in your business with FP&A, with a CFO that you trust, is amazing. And we had good security at Tenable, but it didn't have that same transparency. And just getting on a soapbox for a second, I look at transparency as one of the greatest strengths of the American economy, not only transparency of government, transparency of business, but when it gets to cyber, we really don't have that. So I think what you're doing is incredibly important. So what is the Digital Directors Network? How big is it? How many communities do you have? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's a boardroom association that's really focused on building the practice and profession of digital and cybersecurity risk oversight. So we started out to see if there were other people that saw this as a problem. So we created it as a boardroom network, and our members join because they want to move this needle with their own clients' boards. They want to become board members and help other companies solve this problem. So a lot of world-class CIOs and CISOs, big companies, mid-cap companies for the most part. Not a lot of not-for-profit type of technology leaders, but large cap public company CIOs and CISOs that saw this as a problem, wanted the help to deal with their own boardroom because they were getting pulled in to their boards, certainly through the pandemic, more than they ever have been before. And they really want to get busy at solving the problem. And they've also woken up to the fact that, hey, maybe I should be a corporate director for another company at some point in my career. So how do I start on that journey? Because frankly, I've never been involved in the boardroom before. I've never been invited in. So this is a group that's dedicated to me, and I'll help where I can. Yeah.
And your organization offers a few things. You have your masterclass training, you have your digital and cyber governance leading practice assessment, and you also have an economic impact assessment, which I think is just phenomenal. So what are those things? How do companies engage the Digital Directors Network for those services?
Yeah, it's really around advocating, educating, and enabling at its most basic level. If we want to be a practice and profession, we have to teach people about these issues. It's not just enough to say, here are the 10 questions corporate directors need to ask about cyber or digital transformation. The questions are useless if you don't understand the answers. Corporate directors are there to do more than ask questions. They actually have to question answers. So we're building those skills and capabilities, and signing up for one of our master classes. We bring an executive education experience to this. I'm an adjunct professor at the USC Marshall School of Business. You can see me flying the flag behind me on the wall here. So we're teaching people how to solve the problem, which was where the big gap was in the marketplace. We kept talking about it, but nobody was actually helping business leaders and corporate directors actually solve the problem. So we've raised the awareness, we've created the advocacy, we've raised the volume of the issue. We're teaching people how to solve it. And what's interesting in the boardroom is the issue is moving beyond, cybersecurity metrics to start to understand the economic impact. What's actually at risk? Not just what the risk metrics are about. Well, what's at stake? So the economic impact of cyber risk is something that we're working with a partner, X Analytics, on. And then, that's a consulting, a rapid assessment. Within a period of 7 to 10 days, we can help a board, help a CISO or a CIO have a pretty good estimate of what the true economic impacts of their self-insurance exposure is around cybersecurity. And that's something most corporate boards don't realize. They're largely self-insured for cybersecurity. Our estimates show that only about 5 to 8% of the economic impacts of cyber risk have actually been insured. That's the limit on what the insurance industry has accepted from a risk perspective. And they're under a lot of pressure because they've bitten off more than they can chew here. And so their loss reserves are much higher. Their loss ratios are much higher than they had expected them to be. And so that's putting the burden back on companies to do the heavy lifting and the hard work of actually understanding what the economic impact is of these things. So there's the barriers to starting to solve the problem aren't that high. It's the beauty of this stuff. Getting somebody into the boardroom, we've got 500 plus members that are ready, willing, and able, and have been trained on these issues to join corporate boards. Our master classes are 6.5 hours long, spread over 2 weeks. And then these economic impact assessments that we do, as well as the corporate governance assessments that we do, they're all designed to be executed in a short period of time to give corporate boards a phenomenal amount of, your words, transparency and understanding around these issues.
So at Gula Tech Adventures, we're pushing a concept called data care that really tries to preach the cybersecurity message to non-cyber people. And cybersecurity is such a non-starter and kind of boring with the general public. And we're trying to make it, something that's accessible and inviting as a career field. But not only that, but also, where people would have some personal responsibility. And a lot of times I'll talk to boards and they will just not be that aware of the systemic risk that comes from their IT footprint or the risk of ransomware until it's too late. So what are some of the techniques that you go through to convince a board or help them recruit a potential either cyber lead or data lead? What terminology do you use for these positions?
Yeah, digitally savvy directors, digitally and cyber savvy directors is kind of the nomenclature that we use. We look at, in terms of boardroom effectiveness around these issues, it's a combination of the skills and capabilities on the board, how the board is structured, and then the scope of risk oversight. So we actually do an assessment and a report and a grade for corporate boards to that effect. It's called our DICY, D-I-C-Y is the acronym report. So we have a little bit of fun with that.
I think you have another certification too, the Qualified Technology Expert, which qualifies you to be a technical expert on boards, right?
Well, it certifies that you're qualified to be a technical expert on board. So what we're teaching is these are usually CIOs and CISOs that go through the masterclass, and we test them on what we're teaching them. We're teaching them about digital and cyber governance. We're teaching them about corporate governance. We're also teaching them about systemic risk, which I want to come back to because that's maybe a term that your audience isn't that familiar with. And then, we're putting a label on it, and we want the artifact of certification out there to create a bar to show that there are executives that are actually getting and investing in themselves and starting to understand these things at a different level. We want to make this a practice and profession, so it can't just be a club where we get together, and talk about stuff. We actually have to develop the body of knowledge to do this stuff better, because these new risk domains are just that, new risk domains. We've created new worlds that have created new risks, and we have to figure out new ways to approach these issues.
That's phenomenal. So let's talk about systemic risk a little bit, and then we'll get into, you have a book out there called The Great Reboot, which kind of talks about all these different types of issues, got lots of examples of that. So let me ask you a question. This is kind of a setup. I run a vulnerability scan. On one side of the network, I have 10 computers with one vulnerability each. And on the other side of the network, I have one computer with 10 vulnerabilities on it. Which one's the most complex or vulnerable on the network?
Depends what each one of those parts of the system is doing relative to the purpose of the system as a whole. So it's like a metaphor of a car and a tire. So a car is a complex system comprised of a lot of different parts. A lot of moving parts have to work together for the purpose of the car to go from point A to point B. And so if you look at a flat tire, that's a critical part in the system. If the tire goes flat, it brings the whole system to a standstill. So which part of that that network environment that you described has the potential flat tires that if it fails, it can destroy the whole system. You can't just look at the parts, which is what enterprise risk management taught us. We have to look at the system and what the purpose of that system is. And the system changes when you just look at the car. If you then look at the passengers that were within that car and what the purpose of their trip was, their purpose of being there was, the system starts to take on a new light. You start to frame the system and its purpose differently. And then if you look at the vehicle as a part of a transportation system, if that vehicle is in the middle of the 405 here in Southern California and the tire goes flat at 8:30 in the morning in the middle of rush hour, that flat tire has now impacted the purpose of 50,000 other people's trip, and the system starts to change. So we need to start to look at things differently, look at these systems differently, and understand how those parts interact to impact the purpose of the system that they're a component of.
So it's funny, as an investor, I get a lot of pitches from companies who want to take cybersecurity technology, SIMs, log analysis tools, vulnerability scanners, net flow analysis, and put it all together and start looking at communications patterns and, maybe a server on the inside of the network, or maybe a node on the inside of the network. There's lots of people connecting to it, but nobody going to the internet. That might be a server. Somebody would go into the internet a lot, but not serving up it. That might be a client. And you can assign different levels. And I look at stuff like that and I'm like, yeah, that helps. But it's so hard to know what's the one device that's going to take down everything. Or if you look at some of these outages that Cloudflare's had or Amazon, and you read, it was just one commit and the whole, network kind of falls down. It's so hard to kind of identify these single points of failure, these cascading effects. And that's basically systemic risk, as I think you've outlined in the Great Reboot.
Yeah, and it's a principle that's founded in some of the work that's been done in complex system science, right? The Santa Fe Institute, the work that scientists have done early on in this area have been focused on the human body, have been focused on the natural world, the planet that we occupy, right, and the interdependencies of the systems that support life on this planet. We're now taking some of that thinking and pulling it into the complex digital business system and the boardroom to teach companies about the subsystem of the digital business system. But there are other systems that they're a part of as well. And it's kind of like the mosquito. It's like the human body and the mosquito, right? So the human body is a complex system, a nervous system, a circulatory system, a respiratory system. I think there are like 8, 9, 10, or 11, or 12 subsystems in the human body that make our life possible. But mosquitoes, because we're a complex system in and of itself, and we're inherently complex, will always be inherently complex. There are always inherent vulnerabilities. Mosquitoes will always have an ability to extract value from our complex system. They land on us and do their thing and take some blood away, right? So if the mosquito carries an infection with it, it can contaminate the much broader system. But it's an easy metaphor for people to understand what complex digital business systems are all about. They're inherently complex, and they will always be inherently complex. And so how do you deal with the fact that the system in and of itself is the weak point? Hackers have figured that out. Hackers have been attacking the hackers are the mosquito. They've been attacking the systemic weak points, the employees, SolarWinds, the server hubs, the pieces of software that are going to distribute across broader systems to let the system do the work for them. And so hackers are exploiting these systemic weaknesses. And if they have the ability to know where the systemic weaknesses are, we certainly have the ability to defend the systemic weaknesses better than we are. And that's kind of where this problem is at right now. We need to understand the system and the parts and how they relate together much better than we are.
Yeah. So in the book, the Great Reboot, you kind of break apart some of these issues. And if you could just riff for a minute on the 5 causes of systemic risk, which I just have here. So you have replaceability, interconnectedness, size, complexity, and then cross jurisdiction. Any of those that you see misunderstood? I mean, that made a lot of sense to me, but any of those that you think are misunderstood by the general public or more specifically by boardrooms?
I wouldn't say they're misunderstood. They're just not understood. And actually, we went back to the systemic failures of the financial markets back in 2008. So too big to fail. Banks that were a critical part of the economic and the financial system that couldn't go under because they would have brought the much bigger system down with them. So too big to fail was an example of systemic risk. And so what happened after that is people started to recognize that, wow, we've got this really interconnected, interdependent financial system that we've created. We have to start to understand that better. So Basel III, Dodd-Frank, they started to look at systemic risk. And so they started to introduce some of these principles of replaceability, interconnectedness, the size, the complexity, the heterogeneity, which is what complexity relates to, then the jurisdictionality. Jurisdictionality isn't just necessarily GDPR in the UK or CCPA here in California. It's really about the rule sets that the system has to abide by. So rule sets can be requirements from the users of a system, and the more complex those requirements, the more jurisdictions that the system has to fulfill. And you might there are ways to start to understand vulnerability, what introduces systemic risk into the system. We created that layer of the framework, the director framework, that risk X model, the director framework, to help people think through those parts. Where are the flat tires? How do they relate to the broader system? And how do I understand what's critical and what's not critical?
Yeah, I jumped right into the systemic risk, and I think that's a good discussion. But in the book, you kind of set this up after you talk about the director framework. So I might throw some slides in on the video here after, but you have a couple different components. You had data, architecture, risk communications, emerging tech. You had a whole bunch more. If I just list them off, I'm sure the listeners are going to kind of get lost there. But what I liked about the director framework is I've seen a lot of frameworks for talking about IT. I thought it was laid out pretty well, and it was exactly the kind of level of detail that I thought was good for a board. And then later on in the book, you actually dissect a number of failures, within this director framework. So is this a proprietary framework? Is this something that anybody who's joining the Digital Directors Network can make use of? How do you think about the director framework, and what should our viewers take away from it?
Yeah, we answer the latter part of your question. Yeah, so our members get to use this to change their world and help their boards understand these issues, and they are. And this is what we train and certify them on through the class as well. And the feedback we usually get is, wow, that was really helpful to help me reframe the project, and I can use this immediately, which we really have. Good frameworks, that's what they are. And frameworks are really just structured ways to understand and break down a problem. And, we've all used frameworks as executives throughout our careers. SWOT analysis, Porter's SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 forces. Those are frameworks. This is a framework of that magnitude. And the 8 domains of the director framework are really the 8 domains that comprise every complex digital business system that has to be managed and has to be governed. So we wanted to create a framework that actually showed the system as a system, and then showed what contributes to risk within the system to help leaders really understand the problem at a different level. And so far, it's been very effective, and it's kind of the core of what we're teaching people. Again, back to why we started DDN, we had to teach people how to solve the problem, so we needed to create the artifacts of and the tools for them to do just that, and that's what the director framework's all about.
So in the book, there's a few sections where, it talks about, the limitations or some of the issues with enterprise risk management. And I have a lot of issues with just how we do cybersecurity. At the end of the day, I think there's a lot of hygiene and a lot of hunting, and usually if you have more hygiene and more hunting, you somehow have more security, but it's not quantified. It's not, if you can't measure it, how do you know if you're getting there? But what are some issues you kind of might have with either Sarbanes-Oxley or just, enterprise risk management as it's practiced today?
Yeah, and SOX, and I'd come back from a decade in Tokyo, right when SOX was hitting, and PwC had a lead role to play in drafting the COSO framework, and of course, with the other big 4 rolling the ERM framework. And I think it was good for the time, but it didn't really contemplate 20 years ahead and what would be happening from a technology perspective and its limitations and what it's taught us. It's helped us get up the learning curve without a doubt. So we've gone from ground zero to being, having a structured way to understand enterprise risk and to being educated to that nomenclature and understanding risk mitigation, outcomes, to understanding risk better. But it taught us to kind of dismiss low probability, high impact risks. And in a systemic environment, you can't do that, because look at the O-ring on the Challenger as a systemic failure that we can all relate to. Under ERM, we would have dismissed that. Now let's just live with it. As a systemic risk manager, because that has catastrophic implications on the broader system, as it did, we couldn't dismiss that as a systemic risk thinker. So we have to deal with the risks, the component risks at a different level, and we have to understand how those component risks impact the larger system at a much different level than we did under ERM. It's a new dimension. So ERM kind of got us the 101. This is now the 201, the systemic risk stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the model is, I set you up. Is it one computer with 10 vulnerabilities or 10 computers with a vulnerability each? Which one's more vulnerable? Well, what happens if you take that one computer with one vulnerability and now it's your Salesforce account? How do you think about, the risk of the dependencies of using it? I mean, Salesforce is amazing, kind of a huge uptime, but a very low probability of it failing. And if it went down, and if your company's based on that, how do you even handle that? So modern cybersecurity people just do not think about that in terms of threat feeds and vulnerabilities and that sort of thing. So I like these tools that you've brought to market. And I think the Challenger accident is a great example to kind of remind people that it's systemic risk and not just the face value stuff. What about some more examples that happen in IT, like perhaps the Equifax thing? How do you look at that through the lens of your organization?
Yeah, let me get to Equifax, but you mentioned Salesforce, and Salesforce is a good example because from a management perspective, they've done something very interesting, and they are the definition of a complex digital business system. The risk that is their business, right? They've created this amazing cloud platform, and there are so many connection points and interoperability issues with how they've built this over time, the multi-tenant architecture to all the partners that exist in that ecosystem, and the risk that their solution, that their product introduces to the broader market, every single one of their customers and every single one of their partners. They're the poster child for systemic risk in a cloud environment. They've added a chief availability officer, a management executive whose sole responsibility is to understand. They don't say it in these words, but they use the words that describe, to understand systemic risk across their broader ecosystem. So they've started to deal with this at a management team level differently than they have in the past by having someone responsible for those systemic issues across their platform and across all the stakeholders that are dependent upon that platform. Equifax was a great example of a couple of small failures, very small failures that, digital certificates that were expired, communications around a critical patch that didn't go to everybody that it needed to go to, that started to, the failures started to cascade dominoes. And, that's what systemic risk is, right? The butterfly effect, chaos theory, dominoes, right? One starts to fall and then the dominoes get bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, you can knock over a gigantic, domino the size of the Empire State Building if you start with just a little domino and you cascade it in the right way. And Equifax is that poster child. $3 billion later of actual fines, penalties, costs, the remediation work that they've done, of the real. What's becoming the real impact of these issues, it's the financial impact. It's not so much the brand or the stock price decrease, it's the real financial costs of these issues. And it's becoming focused on business continuity. Hackers have figured out that, the most vulnerable asset that every company has is the ability to transact. Let's shut the company down, or let's make the company shut itself down, which we saw again just today with the company that's the largest meat producer in the world, like we saw with Colonial Pipeline a couple of weeks ago.
So when you see Colonial Pipeline, and I mean, if we were recording this next month or next week, there'd be another hack of the week. If you get a board who comes to you and says, hey, we're thinking about engaging you, are we spending enough money on cybersecurity? I mean, how do you handle a question like that?
Yeah, it's not really about how much money you're spending. It's how secure you are for what you're spending and what you have at risk relative to what you're spending. And so I think the questions have been the wrong questions that boards have been asking. And benchmarking what you're spending against what your peers are spending is a useless exercise because it's never apples to apples. Their risk profile is different. Their digital business system is different. That tells you nothing. The best benchmark that you have is actually what the cost of risk transference is. So if you're paying 250 basis points to transfer risk to a third party cyber insurer and your internal costs are only 100 basis points for what you're spending for internal security for your self-insurance, that's the only benchmark that you should be focused on. And then you need to understand how secure are we, how well do we understand the system for what we're spending to self-insure.
Can you explain that?
Cyber insurance is only getting us a fraction of coverage.
Yeah, can you explain that in terms that more the general public can understand? Like, how do you know? Like, I think J.P. Morgan came out and said we're spending $500 million, $500 million on cybersecurity. What is basis points and risk transference? Like, what does that mean to the average person who's watching?
Yeah, so 250 basis points is 2.5%, right? So if you have $50 million of cyber insurance coverage, your premiums would be $1,250,000 a year. 100 basis points is 1%, so you'd be spending $500,000 a year to self-insure if that was the internal IT costs. What we're seeing is the self-insurance costs are usually much higher than, the risk transfer costs. The cyber insurance costs are much higher than the self-insurance costs. And the insurers have started to realize they've signed up for something much bigger than what they had expected. And they're jacking up premiums, doubling premiums, limiting coverages, trying to take things like extortion under ransomware off the table, which really just jacks up your deductible. So they're not making any money, and they're trying to make more money by raising the premium rates. And so cyber insurance works differently than many other insurance products that you're used to in your life, where you insure. Here in California, I've got earthquake insurance, right? And you have fire insurance, right? If your house burns down, you want it to be rebuilt. Cyber insurance, though, works the opposite way. So cyber insurance maybe only gives you $50 million of initial coverage for whatever policy terms you have in place, but you're self-insured for the catastrophic. So you wear the risk of catastrophe yourself. The largest cyber insurers in the world are companies themselves. It's not the cyber industry, because they're all self-insured for the most part. They haven't realized that yet. They think they've solved the problem by transferring it to the cyber insurance industry, when in reality, they've only made the problem worse because they haven't done the hard work of understanding and mitigating their self-insurance exposure.
Yeah, that's an amazing insight. Because I think a lot of people look at the cyber insurance industry as, the people who can come in and pay for my Bitcoin, when I get my main servers, ransomware, crypto ransomware. But the reality is, cyber insurance for like loss of business, acts of war, complete, loss of intellectual property is a much, much bigger deal than the ransomware. And you're pretty much on your own, even with the cyber insurance. And it's funny because, sometimes we'll talk about, well, why don't, we do more to get people involved in the business? And you really are on your own. The government shows up after the hacks happen, and the insurance companies, aren't really giving you the guidance. It used to be like when you bought a house, hey, get smoke detectors and you're going to, prevent fires and, save loss of life. Cyber, we're not even there yet. We don't have those things to do. And I think until you get your technology and cybersecurity committees and all these different boards, we're not going to have a common language to talk, even from the SEC point of view, about what to do with cybersecurity.
Yeah, and it's I had a conversation with a chair of a public company, a SaaS company, a couple of weeks ago, and the thing about systemic risk is executives get it very quickly. It's a concept that is very easy to to wrap their minds around, because they're kind of process oriented people throughout their careers. They understand process. And so when you start to reframe things as a systems thinker would, the lights go off and they get it. And that tends to be a bit of a frightening moment because, his comment was, well, everything is really systemic risk then. And I said, well, yeah, that's the world we've created. That's an outcome of the complex interconnected world that we've created, not just with digital business systems, but, more broadly from climate to healthcare to transportation. That's an outcome of the fact that we have 8 billion people in the world, and we need to have a complex set of requirements that fulfill the needs and wants of those 8 billion people. So yeah, there are complex systems and complex subsystems everywhere. And your job as a corporate director, you can recognize that complexity and say, okay, how do we ever start to understand that complexity? But it's like going to Las Vegas, and it's going to Las Vegas and not caring about the odds of the game that you're playing. If you want to lose a lot of money, go sit in the Keno room where there's a 40% house advantage versus a 2% house advantage on blackjack. Now, if you're just a recreational gamer and you're betting, $1 at a time, your wife or your husband's not going to be too upset if you lose, a couple of bucks. But if you're putting the mortgage down, they're going to be pretty upset, right? So we don't even know what the risks, what the odds are of the game that we're playing in cybersecurity. So we don't know whether we're playing Keno odds, or we don't know whether we're playing blackjack odds. And compounding that, we don't actually know the value of the chips that we're betting with. So we got white chips, blue chips, red chips. We don't know what the value is. So we don't understand the risk or the value that's at stake. So we're largely flying blind. Most companies are, in terms of cyber risk and its potential impact to the organization. And a board's responsibility is not to fly blind on these issues.
And you're suggesting that we need another committee that would be kind of like a subcommittee of a board, much like we have an audit committee that accepts the risk of the do we believe the audit, was our numbers done in a legal and professional manner? Perhaps a compensation committee where we talk about board comp, executive comp, option pools, that sort of thing. This type of committee, a technology and cybersecurity committee, would be parallel to those types of committees as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a no-brainer. I think it's table stakes, and it's our recommendation that it should be for all the public companies and many private companies as well. But it's also a leading practice. So we're seeing companies like FedEx do this, Hasbro, the company that makes the potato head doll. So why did Hasbro put a data and cyber and data privacy committee in place in 2018 when it took a $5 billion FTC fine for Facebook to force Facebook to put a data privacy committee on their board? So why did Hasbro get this in 2018 but Facebook didn't? So there are leaders that understand these issues. GM has a cyber committee. AIG has a cyber committee. There's not a lot of them, but there are some firms that are kind of blazing a new path here and thinking about these things differently.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I'm going to want to go back and look at this, because one of the criticisms, like I said earlier, I'm a big fan of transparency. But one of the criticisms is that, if you're going to produce your financial statements and your quarterly reports, that you're going to itemize all the vendors you're working with and all your cyber defenses, and you're going to just, we're really weak. Our single point of failure, I want the shareholders to know, is we depend 100% on Salesforce, right? Like, people don't want to put that out there in the public, but that's really what we're talking about, being transparency. So how do you feel about that type of comment?
That requirement's already out there. The 2018 SEC cyber guidance actually says that companies need to disclose material risks and incidents. So they're falling far short on understanding material, or on disclosing material risk, because they don't understand material risks. They're certainly disclosing the incidents after the fact, but the requirement is already out there for public companies to do that here in the United States. Chief Justice, the Delaware Supreme Court, Chief Justice Seitz recently said in December, he said, boards need to be able to demonstrate credibly that they're proactively understanding systemic risk. A pretty big statement, pretty big, powerful statement. That's Chief Justice.
That's astounding. So
and if you were to ask most boards, where are you at on that issue? They'd probably say, what's systemic risk?
Exactly. Exactly. Well,
But the expectations are changing.
Let's talk about some more current events. And of course, next week it'll be out of date because there'll be new events and stuff. But what's your take on the Colonial Pipeline failure?
Yeah, fascinating that they shut down the system without the hackers shutting down the system. And the CEO came out in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, and he said, "Hey, look, we didn't understand the impact. We didn't understand the threat, what had happened, and we didn't understand the risk to the pipeline. So we shut it down." Pretty amazing admission from the chief executive officer that we didn't understand cyber risk, so we shut our business down. But we've seen that before, actually, in other systemic risk issues. When leaders don't understand systemic risks, they have two options when the system starts to fail or when the system is under attack. They can ignore it and take their chances, or they can shut the system down. We saw that with COVID too, right? So states and the federal government took different approaches. And, as a country, we were all over the place because leaders didn't understand the systemic implications. So let's shut it down, or let's just ignore it and take our chances, neither of which are responsible reactions. The third option is we do have the ability to understand this stuff before the fact. So Colonial Pipeline, just another example, just another hack. And the hacks are getting closer to more critical issues. Now the food supply chain, now the energy grid, the energy system, and this stuff is just going to continue because it's easy money for the hackers. We're the weak link. The system is the weak link, and frankly, we're asleep at the switch on this stuff.
So the Biden administration is proposing a $20 billion for cyber. A lot of it's going to the DoD, but lots going to DHS, modernization, defenses, CISA, all the right stuff. I didn't see anything in there that said, these organizations need to understand their systemic risk. I think it's more hygiene, more hunting, again, which will help. But I really wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah, information sharing and focused on federal government and the companies that do business with the federal government. So the critical parts of the federal system. Nowhere near enough for private enterprise. Although I don't think it needs to be another Sarbanes-Oxley type of sledgehammer to the problem. There's a bill that's been reintroduced for the fourth Congress in a row right now. It's Senate Bill 808, the Cybersecurity Disclosure Act. Fourth Congress, this has been reintroduced. It gets introduced, it dies on the vine. It continues to stay alive. So I think it's Warner Collins, and it picks up support every time it's reintroduced. But a simple disclosure requirement, a comply or explain requirement for corporate boards. Is there somebody in the boardroom that understands cybersecurity risk? Who is it? Not a heavy lift. Just put that in your disclosure statement. And if you don't have anybody there, explain to us why you don't need it, which nobody is going to want to explain their way out of. So
I'd be curious why that seems like a really basic thing to put in there.
Which was a part of Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So remember, Sarbanes-Oxley forced financial expertise onto corporate boards. And I always say it's amazing in hindsight that it was only 20 years ago for boards to have somebody in the room that understood a financial statement. That was only 19 years ago. And it took Sarbanes-Oxley to force public companies to put that skill and capability onto the board. S808 would do the same. And I think having that accountability, that fiduciary responsibility now at the board level, and having somebody have to put their name out there as responsible for that is a high impact, low effort way to begin to deal with this issue in the private enterprise sector.
So if our viewers Google you, they'll see that you've written for Forbes a good bit. And I think you wrote about the Suez Canal being blocked. What did you have to say about the Suez Canal?
Yeah, an example of systemic risk. So who would have thought that a ship that's twice as long as the canal is wide could clog up the canal, right? But that's exactly what it did. And think about that ship. So it's an example of technology and how systemic risk creeps in over time. So when the canal was built, I forget what the date was, 100, 120 years ago. The ships weren't that long, right? And now we have these ships that are twice as long as the canal is wide. And, you get what you get. So the risks change. The world's change as the technology evolves. So it was an interesting example of systemic risk. And look at how that single point of failure backed up global supply chain. So another, interesting a technology related systemic risk technology in a different way, unlike the digital business system, but another perfect example of how the world has gotten much more complex, and our understanding of risks hasn't kept up with our understanding or the world that we've created, frankly.
So after 9/11, we had Hollywood theater. We had everybody was thinking up ways to attack America and things we scenarios we had to counter. Do you look at science fiction as potential inspiration or imagination about types of risks that we need to avoid and could result in catastrophes?
Yeah, I'm a big sci-fi fan. My all-time favorite movie, my death row movie. What's the last movie you're going to watch before you go to the electric chair? Is Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston, the original Planet of the Apes. Best ending of a movie ever of all time, and kind of an interesting story of how the system changed. Actually a very good story of systemic failure, risk, and change. Right. So two alternative paths there, and how the entire system changed as a result of decisions back in a point in time.
Are there other types of either boardroom or high-end cyber type of fiction that you've read? Have you read any of the Tom Clancy things that have dealt with cyber warfare, or like Peter Singer's or the latest 2034 book?
I have not, actually. I have not.
They all blame China, which is it's fun and it's great, but China is definitely the new great adversary that America is struggling with, and the books are entertaining. I think it's interesting, but how realistic? It's tough because it's so much of what we do in cybersecurity is classified, or it's hidden in the boardroom. It's not out in the public. So these books might as well be another episode of Harry Potter. We're just going to impugn magical abilities to hack into an F-35 and turn it off. And that's kind of what you're seeing in some of these books.
Yeah, and so China. I was living in China in 1985. Right when PW started the China practice, I was one of the original foreign professionals working in mainland China after Deng Xiaoping opened up China in '79. It was only '79 when that opened up. So we were helping some of the foreign multinationals come into the mainland really for the first time. So I was there before China had done any of this stuff, but it was an open secret back then. Back in '85, that that was the cost, that was the trade-off for getting access to the marketplace. Your IP was going to go out the door. Now anything that's going across the Chinese part of the network is basically going out the door. We've known that since day one. Did we do enough about it? Doubtful. China understands, I would say, the system much better than we do, and how to exploit things, and as do hackers. Hackers find the weak link and they exploit the weak link. There's a reason why the U.S. is the number one destination and target for hackers year in and year out, because this is where a lot of value is at, and this is where a lot of the threats and vulnerabilities can get through. We are the weak link.
So if a viewer's thinking about joining a board and being the head of the cyber committee, or being the lone cyber woman on the board, or however you want to look at that, individuals are not members of the Digital Defenders Network, right? So the Directors Network. So should they be asking, hey, if I join the board as a condition, I want you guys to join the DDN?
Well, DDN is actually, there's directors, sitting directors, and technology executives. It's a curated membership. There are no membership dues. So individuals can join because they want to help solve this problem.
Very good.
Be a part of the network. So, but it is a curated network. We want people that are here. We want quality, not quantity. We want the people that are going to be working actively with us to solve these problems.
So if someone's watching the show and they reach out, how should they go about trying to contact?
Yeah, just go to the website, digitaldirectors.network. There's a two-part process. There's a very short application. We interview everyone. We want people to have not just go through the classes, but we want people, the SEC established threshold for being a financial expert. It's really expertise and experience. So we want people to have the expertise and the experience, understand the governance issues, starting to have an interest in the governance issues. That's usually their weak part, because frankly, they've never been invited into the boardroom before. But be able to check the box in terms of being a digital or a cyber expert, having actually had the functional or executive experience over these domains, so that when we get called from a corporate board that says, hey, Bob, I need a director, a cyber director in this sector, somebody that's got this background. Can you recommend somebody to me? Yeah, we can. We want to be able to recommend our membership to corporate boards looking for these type of directors. We want to be the supply, the source of those qualified technology experts in the boardroom.
Excellent. And where can people get a hold of the Great Reboot book?
Yeah, again, it's on Amazon, but the shortcut, go to digitaldirectors.network again, and you'll see it on the banner, and you'll under books. If you go to About Us, there's a section on books. Take you to the Amazon.
Phenomenal. And then how do people reach you? Do you speak at conferences? Are you on Twitter? Are you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, all the time. Very active on LinkedIn. Bob at digitaldirectors.network is my direct email. I manage that myself. I manage my own calendar myself. Talk to a lot of people throughout the course of a week that are starting to wake up to these issues and starting to do the work of solving it. So welcome to talk to any of your viewers.
That's awesome. Well, I definitely agree that we need more board level discussion of technology, of data, of cybersecurity. And I think your approach is one that I think a lot of people can get behind. I think it absolutely needs to be right next to the way we run companies with the accounting and the transparency and compensation committees and whatnot. So I appreciate the work that you're doing there. Bob, thanks for joining us on another episode of Gula Tech Cyber Fiction.
Thank you, Ron.